The laughter started before she reached the bench. Not loud, not mean enough to be called cruel. Just the quiet, sliding kind of laughter that lives in the corners of a room, when people feel safe enough to share a private thought, without saying it out loud. A look exchanged between two men in the third row. A smile pressed down behind a program held at chin level. Someone in the back clearing his throat in that particular way, that is not a cough but is not quite laughter either, because he is too polite to let it be laughter, but not polite enough to stop it entirely. The woman walking toward the piano did not seem to notice any of it. She was small. That was the first thing you saw. Not small in the way thin people are small, but small in the way that time makes people small, gently, over many decades, as if the body is slowly returning something it borrowed. She moved with the particular care of someone who has learned that floors are not to be trusted, that steps deserve attention, that the space between one place and another is not nothing. Her gray habit fell straight to her shoes. Her hands were folded at her waist. Her face was calm in the way that faces are calm when they have made peace with something the rest of the world is still arguing about. She was 72 years old. The hall was the Salle Rameau, in Lyon, France. It was a Thursday evening in October of 1998, and the room held perhaps 300 people who had paid a modest entry fee for a community fundraiser organized by the Neighborhood Association of the 6th Arrondissement. The proceeds were to go toward restoring the roof of a small local library that had been slowly losing its argument with the rain for the better part of 6 years. It was a good cause. Everyone agreed it was a good cause. But 300 people do not fill a hall on a Thursday evening in October for a good cause alone. They come because their neighbor asked them twice. They come because their wife bought the tickets already. They come because there is something human and pleasant about a room full of people doing a small thing together, and October evenings in Lyon have a way of making the inside of a warm hall feel like exactly the right place to be. The program had been cheerful and unpretentious. A children's choir from a local primary school had opened the evening. 17 children between the ages of 7 and 10, wearing white shirts with varying degrees of success at staying tucked in. They had sung 3 songs, 2 of which were recognizable, and one of which was apparently a modern composition that the music teacher had written herself, a fact she mentioned twice. The audience had applauded with the generous warmth that adults reserve for children who are trying hard and mostly succeeding. After the choir came a retired schoolteacher named Gerald, 68 years old, who played the violin with the focused sincerity of a man who had taken it up at 50 and had no intention of pretending otherwise. He played 2 pieces. The first was recognizable. The second was longer than the audience had expected, but he played it with such evident personal satisfaction that no one felt able to begrudge him the extra 4 minutes. He received warm applause. He bowed 3 times, which was perhaps 1 bow more than strictly necessary, but no one held it against him. Then the MC, a cheerful man named Colin who ran a small printing business on the Rue de Marseille and volunteered for these events because his mother had told him years ago that a man should be useful to his community, stepped back to the microphone with his index cards and announced the next performer. He said her name clearly. He said she was a sister at the Convent of the Visitation, which was perhaps 12 minutes away by foot from the hall. He said she would be playing piano. That was when the figure appeared from the right side of the stage. The laughter, or the thing that was almost laughter but not quite, began in the moment between her first step and her second. It was not provoked by anything she did. She had done nothing wrong. She had done nothing at all except be old, and small, and dressed in a gray habit, and be walking with careful steps toward a large black concert grand that looked, in that moment, almost comically too large for her, the way a child's drawing sometimes puts a tiny person next to an enormous house, and you understand that the person is meant to live there, but cannot quite picture how. A woman near the center of the hall leaned toward her husband and said something quietly. Her husband smiled. He covered the smile with his hand, but his shoulders moved. A young man in the 5th row, perhaps 19 or 20, who had come with a group of friends and who had spent most of Gerald's violin performance checking his watch, said something to the friend beside him. The friend made a face that was trying to be neutral and failing. 2 women near the aisle, both in their 40s, exchanged a look. It lasted only a second. It was the kind of look that does not need words because both people already know what is being said. None of this was dramatic. None of it was visible from the stage, and none of it was entirely comfortable to be part of, which is perhaps why each person who did it quietly, privately, as if that made it smaller. The nun reached the piano bench. She stood beside it for a moment. She looked at it. Then she reached down and moved it, adjusting it by what appeared to be a very small amount, perhaps 3 centimeters, perhaps less, inward toward the keys. She did this with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who has done this exact thing many thousands of times and knows precisely what distance she needs between herself and the instrument. She took off her glasses. This surprised several people in the front rows, who had assumed, reasonably, that someone who wore glasses would need them to read music. But there was no music on the stand. There had been no music there when she arrived, and she had not brought any. She folded her glasses carefully and set them on the closed lid of the piano, to the right of the keyboard. She sat down. She arranged the hem of her habit. She placed her hands in her lap, not on the keys, just in her lap, and she sat still for a moment. Not a long moment. 4 seconds, perhaps 5. But in the context of 300 people watching a small old woman in a gray habit sit down at a piano that was too large for her, 4 seconds felt like considerably more. In that silence, the last few quiet conversations in the back rows faded out, not because anyone told them to stop, simply because the silence had a quality to it that made talking feel like the wrong choice, though no one could have said exactly why, not yet. She raised her hands from her lap. She placed them on the keys. And then Colin, still standing in the wings with his index cards, heard the first note of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, and he stopped reading his cards. The morning Sister Marie-Pierre was born. Her father was at work. This was not unusual for 1926, and it was not unusual for a man named Henri, who ran a small hardware shop on a narrow street in the 3rd arrondissement of Lyon, and who understood his responsibilities to his family as a list of concrete things to be accomplished each day, weather permitting. The baby's arrival had been expected, and expected things, in Henri's understanding of the world, did not require a man to abandon his shop. His wife, Celestine, had her mother with her. Everything was arranged. Henri came home at 7 in the evening, held his daughter for 6 minutes, said she looked healthy, and went to bed early, because the next morning he had a delivery of copper pipe fittings coming at 6 o'clock. The baby was their 3rd child, and their 2nd daughter. She was given the name Marguerite. She would not be called Sister Marie-Pierre for another 23 years. She was 4 years old when she climbed onto the piano bench for the first time. The piano had belonged to her grandmother, who had played it with moderate skill and great love until her hands grew stiff, and who had then donated it to the family, with the understanding that someone would learn to play it properly, which was a polite way of asking for something without directly asking. The piano sat in the front room of the family's apartment on the 2nd floor, where it occupied more space than the room comfortably wanted to give it, and where it went largely unplayed for 2 years, used mainly as a surface for setting things down. Marguerite climbed onto the bench one afternoon in the autumn, when her mother was in the kitchen and her older siblings were at school. She had watched the piano for a long time, not from that close. From across the room, from the doorway, from the hallway beyond the doorway, she had a child's instinct that this object was serious, that it was not a toy, that it asked something of you simply by existing. She had been waiting for a moment that felt right, and one Tuesday afternoon when the apartment was quiet and the light came in low and golden through the front window, the moment felt right. She sat down. She looked at the keys. She pressed one. The sound that came out stopped her completely, not because it was loud, though it was louder than she had expected, but because it had a shape to it, a beginning and a middle and an end, and in between those things was something she could not name, and would spend the rest of her life reaching toward. She pressed another, and another. She was still sitting there when her mother found her 40 minutes later. Celestine stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her youngest daughter press keys with one finger, not randomly but with what appeared to be some kind of intention, listening to each note before moving to the next. Celestine could not have explained what she was seeing, exactly, but she recognized it. It was the look of someone finding a door they had not known was there. The piano lessons began 6 weeks later, with a woman named Madame Fournier who lived 1 floor above them, and who charged 2 francs per lesson, and who told Celestine, After the third lesson, that Marguerite had something. Celestine asked what she meant by something. Madame Fournier said she was not certain she could explain it, but that she would know it if she heard it, and that she had heard it. By the time Marguerite was 7, Madame Fournier had said quietly, and only to her husband, that she was no longer the right teacher for this child. This was a difficult thing to say. It was a more difficult thing to mean, but she meant it. By the time Marguerite was 12, she was practicing 3 hours every day, not because anyone forced her to, not because it was required, because 3 hours left her with the feeling that she had done something real with the day, and anything less than 3 hours left a small, quiet dissatisfaction that stayed with her until the next morning when she could sit down again. By the time she was 15, she was playing Chopin. Not playing at Chopin, the way students play at things they are not ready for, making all the right notes in approximately the right order, and producing something that is technically correct and emotionally hollow. She was playing Chopin in the way that requires you to have felt something. She had not felt everything yet. She was 15, but she had felt enough. The Conservatoire National de Lyon accepted 12 students per decade into its advanced program. The audition was held in a large room with wooden floors and tall windows, and a panel of 5 people who had spent their professional lives listening to piano, and who were consequently very difficult to impress. Marguerite was 17 when she auditioned. She wore a blue dress that her mother had made, and she sat down at the unfamiliar Bechstein in the center of the room, and did not look at the panel before she played, which one of them would remember later as the thing that told him what was coming. She played the same ballade, the one she would play 33 years later in the Salle Rameau, in front of 300 people who had already begun to laugh. The panel did not speak during the piece. This was not unusual. What was unusual was that they did not speak for almost 30 seconds after it ended, which was unusual, and which one of the younger members of the panel would describe to his wife that evening as the experience of being briefly inside something that was larger than the room. She was accepted. She spent 4 years at the Conservatoire. She practiced 5 hours a day, and sometimes 6. She learned things about music that she could not have imagined, sitting on that bench at 4 years old with one finger, pressing keys in the quiet afternoon. She learned that music was a language, and that some people spoke it, and some people simply moved their mouths. She learned that technique was a door, and that what lived behind the door was something technique alone could never reach. She learned that the space between notes was not silence but something closer to held breath, and that this was where the real conversation happened, between the notes, in the places that were not sound. She also learned something else. In her 3rd year, a concert was arranged. The Conservatoire's advanced students were to perform before an invited audience in the same hall where she had auditioned. She was to play 2 pieces. She had prepared for 6 weeks. She had played both pieces until they were so close to her that she could not hear them clearly anymore, the way you lose the ability to see your own face. The night before the concert, she lay awake in her room and understood something that no amount of practice had prepared her for. She was afraid. Not of forgetting the notes, not of making mistakes, exactly. Afraid of something she could not quite locate. Something about the distance between playing alone and playing for other people. Something about what it felt like to let other people inside the things she loved most, to let them have opinions about it, to let them be present in the space where she had always been alone. She lay there for a long time, looking at the ceiling, and the fear did not go away. It did not get smaller. But somewhere in the middle of the night she decided it did not have to. She played the concert the next evening. She walked out onto the stage and sat down and played both pieces, and the audience applauded, and one of her teachers told her afterward that it had been excellent, and she thanked him. But she knew something had been different, not wrong, not worse, but different. Playing for herself and playing for others were not the same act, and they used different muscles, and she would need to learn both. She was still learning when the other thing happened. It came quietly, the way the most important things often do, not as a crisis, not as a revelation in the dramatic sense, more like a gradual clarification, the way a foggy morning does not suddenly become clear, but simply becomes clearer, and then clearer still, until you realize the fog has been gone for some time, and you cannot say exactly when it left. She was 21 years old. She was in her final year at the Conservatoire. Her teachers spoke of concert engagements, of professional life, of a path that was visible and well lit, and that many people would have considered a remarkable gift. She looked at the path, she looked at it honestly, and she understood that it was not hers. She did not arrive at this understanding easily. She did not arrive at it overnight. She argued with it, the way you argue with something true that you do not want to be true, pointing out its inconveniences, questioning its evidence, testing whether it would change its mind if she applied enough pressure. It did not change its mind. What she felt toward music was real. What she felt toward the life of a performing musician was something more complicated. The concert halls, the audiences, the reviews, the ongoing necessity of making other people understand what she had already understood privately. She was not afraid of it. It was not that. It was more that it was not the thing. It was a version of the thing, but not the center of it. The center of it was the playing itself, the practice, the daily returning to the instrument in a quiet room, the ongoing conversation between her hands, and the sound and the something that was not her, but was reached through her when she played well. That was the thing. That was what she needed. She entered the convent of the Visitation in the spring of 1948. Her father did not understand. Her mother wept, and then, over the following months, arrived at a kind of peace with it, the peace that comes from watching your child walk toward something with their whole self, rather than toward something that was supposed to be their whole self, but clearly was not. Her older sister was bewildered. Her older brother said nothing, which was his way of saying a great deal. The convent had a piano. A small upright, not well tuned, with 2 keys that stuck slightly. She played it for an hour every evening, when the day's work was done, not for the sisters, not for anyone, for the reasons she had always played, because 3 hours made the day real, and an hour in a small room with an imperfect upright made the day real enough, because the conversation did not require a concert hall, because the door did not require an audience. She played alone for 50 years. She played the opening phrase of the ballade, and in the 3rd row, a man named Arthur turned his head. He had been looking at his program. He had been reading the description of the bake sale that would follow the performances, partly out of genuine interest in the baked goods, and partly because his attention had wandered during Gerald's violin playing, not out of unkindness but simply because attention wanders, because that is what attention does in the warm middle of a Thursday evening in October, when you have eaten dinner, and the room is comfortable, and the day has been long. He turned his head when he heard the first note. He would not be able to explain this later, not precisely. He would say that it was different from what he had expected, which was true, but was not specific enough. He would say that the note had a quality that made him pay attention, which was true, but was also true of many sounds. What he would not say, because he was not a man who spoke in these terms, was that the note had arrived in the room the way certain people arrive in a room, carrying something with them that changes the air slightly, not dramatically, not with any announcement, but changes it nonetheless. And everyone who is paying attention at all can feel the change without knowing what to call it. He put the program on his knee. His wife noticed him turn his head and turned her own. She listened for 4 seconds. Then she sat up a little straighter, the small, unconscious adjustment of a person who has just decided to be present for something. In the 5th row, the young man who had been checking his watch stopped checking his watch. This happened in the way that things happen when they are real, without a decision, without a moment of choosing. His hand was moving toward his jacket pocket where the watch was, a habitual gesture that had been performed perhaps 15 times already that evening, and then the first phrase of the ballad arrived in the room, and his hand stopped moving. He did not know why. He did not analyze it. He simply stopped and listened, and did not go for the watch again. The 2 women near the aisle, the ones who had exchanged the look, both turned to face the stage at approximately the same moment. They did not look at each other again for the rest of the performance. The woman who had leaned toward her husband took her hand from his arm. She had not been aware that her hand was on his arm until she moved it. She had been unconsciously bracing herself for something she was going to find mildly amusing. She was no longer bracing. At the piano, Sister Marie-Pierre was playing. She was not performing. This distinction matters. It is the difference between a person who is showing you something and a person who is doing something, and you happen to be present. A performer is always partly watching the audience, reading them, adjusting for them, conscious of them as a presence that must be managed. What Sister Marie-Pierre was doing was not that. She was playing the ballad, the way she had played it 10,000 times in a quiet room by herself, with complete attention, and no remainder left over for anything else. The audience did not disappear for her. They were simply not the thing she was attending to. Her hands moved across the keys with a certainty that was not speed. It was not force either. Not the kind of technical authority that comes from pressing harder. It was the certainty of deep familiarity, the way a person moves in their own home in the dark, knowing where the walls are, knowing how the floor feels, knowing without looking. The ballade is not a simple piece. It is not simple in the technical sense, though it is technically demanding. It is not simple in the emotional sense, which is the sense that matters more. It was composed by a man who was dying, not quickly but over years, who knew he was dying, who had lost his country, and much of what he loved, and who put all of this into music, not as an expression of grief, exactly, but as something harder to name, a kind of testimony, a record of having been alive to something beautiful, and terrible, and irreplaceable, a record that would outlast the man who made it. To play it well requires you to carry some of that, not all of it, not the specific grief of Chopin's specific life, but something that corresponds to it, some understanding of loss and beauty and time, some knowledge of what it feels like to love something that will not last. You cannot fake this. You can make all the right sounds and it will still be absent, a shape where a thing should be. And when it is present in a way that the listener feels before they identify, feels in the body before the mind has put a name to it. The hall felt it. 3 minutes into the piece, the small residual noise that always lives in a full room, the quiet shufflings and breath adjustments and small mechanical sounds of 300 people occupying chairs, had gone almost completely quiet. Not the deliberate quiet of an audience being respectful, the quiet that settles when people have stopped thinking about themselves. Colin, in the wings, had stopped thinking about his index cards entirely. He was standing very still, which was not his natural state. Colin was a man of continuous small motion, adjustments of posture and pocket checking, and the habitual running of a hand through his hair that his wife had commented on so many times she had eventually stopped commenting. He was standing completely still, his index cards loose in one hand, slightly angled toward the floor, and he was listening with his whole face in the way that very young children listen to things that interest them, and that adults mostly stop doing. 4.5 minutes in, something happened that had not been planned. The soft pedal mechanism of the Steinway, which was old and had been giving the hall's regular technician a quiet concern for several months, caught, just briefly, a small mechanical click, distinct and clear in the silence of the room, followed by the pedal's slight resistance and then release. A different player might have faltered. A different player might have made the micro-adjustment visible, the brief tension of someone responding to a mechanical surprise, the half-second interruption that audiences feel even when they cannot see it. Sister Marie-Pierre did not falter. The phrase she was playing absorbed the click and continued, and the continuation was so smooth and so complete that several people in the front rows who heard the click were genuinely uncertain for a moment whether it had been part of the music. The sound closed over it, the way water closes over a stone, and then the music moved forward, because music, when it is really being played, and not just performed, always moves forward, because that is its nature, because it lives in time, and time does not accommodate interruptions. In the back row, a boy of 17 named Owen, who had been brought by his grandmother, and who had spent the first part of the evening with his arms crossed, and his posture arranged to communicate that he was somewhere else in every sense that mattered, was sitting forward in his chair now. His arms were no longer crossed. He was not aware of either of these things. He was listening. At 6 minutes, the ballade entered the passage that Chopin had placed near its end, the place in the music that is not quite a storm, but is the knowledge that a storm is coming, the gathering of everything the piece has been building toward, the full statement of what had so far been only suggested. It was the musical equivalent of a held breath released, and it arrived in the hall with the force of something that had been inevitable all along. Owen felt something move in his chest. He would not speak about this for several years. When he eventually did, he would be 24 years old, and he would be trying to explain to a friend why he had started learning piano at 18, entirely on his own, for no reason anyone in his life could account for. He would say that there was a moment in a concert hall when he was 17 when he heard something that made him feel like the world was larger than he had been treating it. He would not mention that he had been crying. He did not think it was relevant. He also thought, correctly, that his friend already knew. The ballade has a final chord. It is not a gentle ending. Chopin did not believe in gentle endings. Not for this piece. The final bars are large and conclusive. A door closed with the full weight of everything that came before it. Not a slam, not a violence, but a completion. The satisfying, definitive closing of something that has said everything it needed to say. Sister Marie-Pierre played the final chord. The sound filled the hall, and then slowly, naturally, the way sound in a large room always does, it began to decrease. It passed through the air, and into the walls, and into the wooden chairs, and into the bodies of the people sitting in them, and then it was gone. The silence that followed was complete. Not the pre-performance silence, which is a held silence, an anticipatory silence, a silence with forward pressure in it. This was a different kind. This was the silence that comes after. It had no pressure. It had no direction. It was simply the state the room found itself in after something had passed through it and left it changed. It lasted 5 seconds, perhaps 6. Arthur, in the third row, was the one who began. He brought his hands together, and the sound of it was so clear in the silence that the woman to his left startled slightly. Then she began as well, and the man beside her. The sound grew the way fires grow when you feed them properly, from one point, and then two, and then too many to count, and then a roar. 300 people standing up. Not all at once. Almost, but not quite, the way these things always happen. A wave that begins at one point and crosses the room, each person rising as it reaches them, and by the time it has crossed from front to back, the whole room is on its feet, and the sound has become something that fills the chest cavity, as well as the ears. Sister Marie-Pierre sat at the piano for a moment after the chord ended. Just a moment. She was not playing anymore. Her hands were in her lap. She was present in the hall again, which she had not fully been for the past 7 minutes. Present in the way that people become present again after coming back from somewhere. She heard the applause begin. She replaced her glasses, folded them open, and set them on her face with the same matter-of-fact precision with which she had removed them. She adjusted the hem of her habit. She stood from the bench, and she moved the bench back by 3 centimeters, the same distance she had moved it inward when she arrived. She walked to the center of the piano, which is the conventional place to stand when acknowledging an audience. She did not bow. She stood there for a moment, looking at the room, at the 300 people who were standing, and making the sound that rooms make when something real has happened in them, and her expression was calm, and something in the calmness of it was not distance. It was not remoteness. It was simply the expression of someone who had done the thing they came to do, and had done it fully, and had no remainder of performance left over to offer. She turned and walked back to the side of the stage, one careful step at a time. Colin watched her go. He had not moved from his position in the wings for the entire 7 minutes. His index cards were still in his hand, still angled slightly toward the floor. He would later tell his wife, with a specificity that surprised her, given that Colin was generally not a precise man about emotional matters, that he had felt during the performance as though he had been rude to someone, and that he could not identify exactly when it had happened, only that it had. In the third row, Arthur sat back down before the applause had fully died, not out of indifference, but out of the particular state of a person who has received something and needs a moment to process it. His wife sat beside him. She had been crying, quietly, without drama, and she was not embarrassed by this, which was also unusual for her, and which she would think about occasionally in the following weeks, without arriving at a satisfactory explanation. Owen, in the back row, remained standing after most of the room had sat back down. Not as a statement. He was simply still there, in the place the music had left him, and it took a moment for the ordinary world to reassemble itself around him. The 2 women near the aisle sat down at approximately the same moment. They looked at each other then. The look they exchanged was nothing like the look they had exchanged before the performance. It held none of that earlier thing in it. What it held instead was the look of 2 people who have witnessed something together and know it, and who understand that this is enough, that this does not need words, that words would in fact be a diminishment. The young man in the fifth row put his jacket back on. He did not know when he had taken it off. He did not check his watch again. He sat through the remainder of the program, 2 more acts, both perfectly pleasant, both received with warm and appropriate applause, and he was present for all of it in a way he had not been present for anything before the nun played. The bake sale after the performance raised considerably more money than it had ever raised at a previous event of this kind. This was not explicable by any change in the baked goods, which were the same as always, competent, some of them better than competent, all of them made with genuine care by people who had woken up early to make them. Colin's wife, who had organized the bake sale, would later say that people seemed to want to be generous, that they arrived at the table with their money already out, not calculating, simply buying, and that she could not account for it. Colin himself stepped back to the microphone after Sister Marie-Pierre left the stage and thanked her, and the audience, which had just sat back down, rose again briefly. Then he proceeded to the next item on his index cards with a focused professionalism that was, those who knew him well would have said, slightly unlike him. He was more careful that evening than he usually was. He chose his words more precisely. He did not make the 2 jokes he had planned to make, not because he had decided against them, but because they did not occur to him when the time came for them, the way a key can be in your pocket all day, and then not be there when you actually need the door. Sister Marie-Pierre walked back through the door at the side of the stage and into the corridor behind it, where a volunteer had left a small folding chair and a cup of water. She sat down. She drank the water. She was not out of breath. She did not look emotional in the way people look emotional after something significant has happened to them publicly. She looked the way she always looked after playing, quietly complete, as though a circuit had been closed. A young woman named Frances, who was volunteering that evening, and whose job was to manage the performer's entrance and exit, had been standing in the corridor when Sister Marie-Pierre came off the stage. Frances was 23 years old and had spent the past 7 minutes standing very still in the corridor, listening to the music come through the door, which she had left slightly open, and she had been crying, silently, standing up, in a way that she was still slightly bewildered by afterward, because she was not someone who cried at music, or at least she had not thought she was. She offered Sister Marie-Pierre the cup of water. The nun took it and said thank you, and her voice was exactly as it had been when she arrived, a quiet and ordinary voice, a voice with no sense of occasion in it, a voice that had just played the Chopin Ballade No. 1 to 300 people, and had now said 2 words in a corridor, and intended for the 2 things to be equally ordinary. Frances could not think of anything to say. She wanted to say something. She felt that something should be said, that the situation required a comment or a response, some acknowledgement of what had just occurred. But nothing she could think of was adequate, and inadequate seemed worse than nothing. She said nothing. They sat together in the corridor for a moment, the young woman standing and the old nun sitting, both of them quiet, and the sound of the next performer reaching the microphone drifted through the slightly open door. Sister Marie-Pierre finished the water. She stood. She thanked Frances again for the water. She walked back toward the entrance through which she had arrived, the same careful steps, the same unhurried pace, the same folded hands. Frances watched her go. She stood in the corridor for a moment after the door at the end of it closed, and then she went back to her volunteering duties, which included helping people find their seats and pointing people toward the bathrooms, and she did these things for the rest of the evening with a particular attentiveness, as if she had been reminded that ordinary things deserve your full presence. The hall raised 3 times its target that evening. Owen began piano lessons 14 months later. He had thought about it for 14 months first, which was how he worked, slowly, carefully, certain that the impulse would pass, and then more certain, as the months went by, that it would not. He called the conservatoire on a February morning and asked about adult beginner lessons, half expecting to feel embarrassed by the call and not feeling embarrassed at all. His first teacher asked him, in the first lesson, what had made him want to start. He thought about how to answer this. He thought about a Thursday evening in October, and a small woman in a gray habit, and a hall full of people who had been quiet in a way he had never heard a room be quiet before. He thought about a sound that had arrived and changed the air, and about standing in a back row with his arms uncrossed, and about something moving in his chest that he had not known was there. He said, There was a piece of music I heard, and I wanted to know how it worked. His teacher nodded. This was, she said, the best reason she had ever heard. Sister Marie-Pierre played the convent piano that evening when she returned, as she did every evening. The small upright with the two keys that caught slightly, the untuned strings, the quiet room. She played for an hour, in the dark, before going to bed. Not the ballade, something else, something she had been working on for several weeks, something that was giving her difficulty in the third phrase, and that she had not yet resolved to her satisfaction. She played it 6 times. On the 6th time, the third phrase came right. She sat for a moment after it, hands in her lap, in the quiet room. Then she closed the lid and went to bed.